Picture this. It's 1933. The world is a mess. The Great Depression has its claws deep into America. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union, a vast and mysterious communist empire, is sealed off from much of the Western world. For 16 long years, the United States has refused to even acknowledge its existence. It's like the world's biggest game of silent treatment between two budding superpowers. Why the cold shoulder? Well, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the U.S.N. was deeply suspicious. They saw communism as a direct threat to capitalism and democracy. Plus, the Soviets had nationalized American property and refused to pay back debts from the old Tsarist regime. So, Washington said, no thanks, and for over a decade and a half, there were no official phone calls, no ambassadors, no diplomatic ties. It was a relationship defined by a void. But by 1933, the world had changed. In America, a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had just swept into office. FDR was a pragmatist, a leader who believed in bold, new ideas to solve the country's desperate problems. With millions of Americans unemployed, he was looking for any and every advantage to kickstart the economy. And that's when he looked at the map and saw a giant untapped market, the Soviet Union. Think about it. A country of 160 million people. American businesses like Ford and General Electric were already doing some back-channel deals, but they wanted more. They dreamed of selling tractors, machinery, and all sorts of goods to the Soviets. The potential was enormous. Business leaders started whispering in Washington's ear, hey, what if we just talk to them? Think of the jobs, the money. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Joseph Stalin was also feeling the pressure. His grand plans for industrializing the Soviet Union were ambitious, but he needed technology and expertise from the West. More urgently, he was getting nervous about his neighbors. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had just risen to power, and his anti-communist rhetoric was loud and clear. To the east, Imperial Japan was expanding aggressively into Manchuria, right on the Soviet doorstep. Stalin realized that having no relationship with the United States left him dangerously isolated. He needed a friend, or at least a powerful acquaintance, to counterbalance these growing threats. So, the stage was set. Two powerful nations, each with their own urgent reasons, began to cautiously circle each other. It was a geopolitical dance, and FDR made the first move. In October 1933, he sent a carefully worded letter to the Soviet head of state, inviting him to send a representative to Washington to discuss the abnormal relationship between their countries. Stalin didn't send just anyone. He sent his foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov. Litvinov was a fascinating character, a sharp, sophisticated diplomat who had lived in London and spoke fluent English. He was the perfect choice to charm the Americans. When he arrived in Washington in November, it was a media sensation. For the first time in 16 years, a top Soviet official was on American soil, ready to talk. The negotiations were intense, taking place right in the White House. FDR and Litvinov spent hours hashing out the details. There were three major sticking points. First, the old debts. The Soviets didn't want to pay. The Americans insisted. Second, religious freedom. Americans were horrified by stories of religious persecution in the officially atheist Soviet Union, and FDR needed to assure the public that American citizens in the USSR would be safe to practice their faith. And third, the most sensitive issue of all, propaganda. The U.S.N. demanded that the Soviets stop funding and supporting communist activities in America, which they saw as an attempt to undermine their government from within. FDR and Litvinov went back and forth, a high-stakes negotiation that would shape the future of the world. On the debt issue, they essentially agreed to disagree and kick the can down the road, creating a vague agreement to settle it later. Spoiler alert, it never really got settled. On religious freedom, Litvinov gave assurances that Americans in the USSR would have the right to worship freely. This was a major PR win for Roosevelt back home. And on the propaganda issue, Litvinov signed a pledge promising that the Soviet Union would not interfere in the internal affairs of the United States. This was the key that unlocked the whole deal. Even though many in the U.S.N. government were skeptical that the Soviets would actually honor this promise, the written guarantee was enough for FDR to move forward. Finally, on the evening of November 16, 1933, the deal was done. In a simple exchange of letters, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Maxim Litvinov formally established diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The 16-year silence was broken. The immediate aftermath was a mix of excitement and skepticism. The New York Times hailed it as a landmark achievement. Businesses were thrilled, envisioning a flood of new trade. The first U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, William Bullitt, arrived in Moscow to a surprisingly warm welcome. For a brief moment, it felt like the dawn of a new era of cooperation. But the honeymoon didn't last long. The trade boom that American businesses hoped for never fully materialized. The debt issue remained a sore point, and the promise to stop subversive activities, well, let's just say the American Communist Party didn't suddenly close up shop. The fundamental ideological clash between capitalism and communism hadn't disappeared. The distrust was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. So, was it a failure? Not at all. The 1933 recognition was a pivotal moment. It was a pragmatic decision born of necessity, a recognition of reality. It opened a vital line of communication that would become absolutely critical less than a decade later during World War II. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the U.S. and the USSR found themselves unlikely allies. That alliance, which was essential to defeating the Axis powers, would have been nearly impossible to forge from scratch without the diplomatic groundwork laid in 1933. The story of the Soviet normalization is a masterclass in realpolitik. It shows how even the deepest ideological divides can be bridged when national interests align. It was a gamble by two of the 20th century's most formidable leaders, FDR and Stalin, driven by economic desperation and geopolitical fear. It didn't create a lasting friendship, but it did end a period of dangerous isolation and, in doing so, reshape the global balance of power on the eve of the world's greatest conflict. It proves that sometimes in history, just starting a conversation can change everything. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into diplomatic history interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. See you next time.